Peasants, trade, and cities. The objectives are 1. Discuss the new farming practices, the growth of trade, and the rise of cities that created a flourishing European society. And 2nd, explain how the revival of trade and the development of a money economy offered a new opportunity for people. Now, at this period in medieval history, a new agriculture exploded in Europe. Europe experienced a dramatic population increase. You have numerous high numbers of people surviving beyond the normal rates of childbirth and child death rates. And so abnormally, you have people surviving much longer than you had in earlier ages. So from 1000 to 1300, you have a population that raises almost 50%, 38 million to 74 million, which is a dramatic increase in population in Western Europe. And this is largely contributed by several factors, largely based around agriculture. Now, some of these causes are, first, conditions were, of course, more settled and peaceful in general. You can't underestimate the political context that surrounds the conditions of people and what context they're living in. But then, second, a dramatic expansion of food production. You have much more food available, which is a huge deal because when people have a higher caloric intake, their bodies tend to be much more healthy, at least in this ancient context, this medieval context. And so people are much more healthy and therefore have better immune systems and live much longer. Children live much longer. Now, this dramatic food production might be contributed by the fact that there was a dramatic improved climate, much more warmer and hospitable, particularly to agricultural production, than centuries prior to this. And so we see kind of a warming trend emerging at that time. But also you have new lands that are beginning to emerge. You have trees and forests being cut down and cleared, swamps being drained. All of these factors will contribute to more territory for fields to grow in, more farms, which leads to more agricultural output and tangibly more food. Now, there are, of course, some major technological shifts that occur at this age as well, particularly new ways of harnessing the power of water and wind. So we're talking about windmills and water mills, which are harnessed for the purpose of milling grain, which would normally have to be done by hand or done manually by some other beast of burden. So they developed certain machines to grind grain and do certain tasks by the power of water and wind. The other major shift is that iron was starting to be used on a regular basis for farming. Now, of course, this had existed prior to this during a classical period, but had largely dissipated and disappeared during the quote-unquote Dark Ages, during that early medieval conquest by barbarian tribes. But iron began to be used in scythes, axes, hoes, hammers, nails, everyday farm tools. But this is huge because the other option would be wood. And of course, wood is not as hard, it's not able to do the task as well. I mean, this can be very simple with hammer and nails. I mean, can you imagine hammering in and putting a building together with wood nails? It's not going to be as sturdy as using iron. So these are major changes that occur, but the biggest issue is agriculture and being able to penetrate that hard soil, particularly in northern Europe. I mean, the soil can be pretty rough, pretty hard, particularly having to do with the colder climate. And that iron is able to penetrate that hard, cold soil. And one of the inventions that was developed to do this was the caruca, which was a heavy wheeled plow with iron plowshares, and it would dig deep into the soil, and it's got obviously the iron tip in the front that allows it to actually dig in, but also you have paneling boards on the sides that allows for the soil that's being dug out to be pushed aside rather than falling into the furrow that's being dug. So that's a major development that allows for more clear and useful and easy ways to dig furrows and to generally increase agricultural output. Now, also, it should not be underestimated the development of a new horse collar. Now, typically, you had the oxen collar, but oxen weren't as popular in some areas than horses. And so, by using an oxen collar on a horse, it really puts a lot of pressure on the neck of the horse due to the position and difference between the beast of the shoulders. And so, the weight is placed in different areas. But by inventing a new collar that's specifically used for horses, it allows the ease of distribution of weight to be really placed on a horse specifically and its shoulders, which allows for it to do harder and longer work than it normally did. Of course, another major development is the development of horseshoes in general, which made it easier for horses to pull heavy loads. I mean, if you've seen a horseshoe being shot onto the hoof of a horse, right, and then little nails driving in that metal shoe onto the bottom, I mean, it allows it, of course, to work much longer, but cross harder terrain. And so, in general, this is a major shift toward productivity. But probably one of the most important shifts in productivity is a different approach to the actual growing process. Early on in the medieval period, Europe practiced something called a two-field system. Now, the two-field system was essentially that a farm was divided into two sectors, one that was actually being used or grown, and the other that would lay fallow. That is, that nothing would grow on it, that you would leave it for that year, that because obviously you would want to leave it without anything because of the nutrients. If you continue to grow everywhere, the soil will eventually be robbed of its nutrients and then will not grow sufficiently in the future. But in that case, you're really only producing half the amount of uh, agricultural output of product as you could. But when they shift into a three-field system, where they take that same amount of soil, that same parcel of land, and divide it up into three sectors, two of which will be a fall and a spring, so you have a balance in terms of product, and then the third lay fallow. I mean, initially you have more food being produced annually, which is clear right there. But beyond that, then, you'd have a balance in the seasons, a new yield in the fall and spring, which would make it much easier to go through the year than if you had only planted half of your fields. So this artist's illustration here kind of depicts what a manorial system and a manner in terms of the planting seasons would look like. Now, immediately just to kind of orient yourself with this map, you could see the manor house, you can see the church, you can see the village, you can see the meadows that are near it, of course. But looking at the total field system, you can see the spring planting, the autumn planting right away on the screen here. Now, the little strips are actually correlating to particular farmers' individual strips of land. They didn't actually use giant blocks or squares of land to be divided up to particular people. Every single villager had his own particular strips of land. And this had to do with the fact that the plow didn't really have a pivot or an axle in the sense of being able to turn. So that you had to really go straight and turn on a wide angle. And so you didn't really have people that had, strips of land that were right next to each other but spread out. Now, this might get confusing, and I'm sure no doubt led to various fights. But back to the point. There's the spring planting here, the autumn planting. So those are our two seasons that will be harvested in proper time. And then you see up here on the left the fields that are laying fallow. So what everyone would do, they would bring all the animals over here, and this is where they would defecate. This is where they would do their business right into the soil. Why? Because then the animals would come over and they would tap it down into the soil as they're going to the bathroom. And this, of course, acts like a natural fertilizer in which it is kind of restoring the nutrients of the soil, ready to plant again in the next season. Now, in general, this manorial system is set up and governed by a lord or knight. Now, largely, this parcel of land is called a fief. A fief is granted to a lord or knight, usually by the king. Now, technically, this land belongs to the king. It does not belong to the lord. It does not belong to the knight. It is being used by them to manage for their own economic gain and for the gain of the community in general. Now, a manor was an agricultural estate, kind of like a plantation, run by a lord and worked by the peasants. Now, a peasant is a regular person who is a farmer and is doing his duty and pays his taxes in portion to the king and to the lord, and this is how the labor system was divided. Now, the problem is that sometimes these peasants would fall into debt. They would owe the manorial lord or knight labor or product, and they aren't able to pay. Say you had a bad harvest season, and you don't have the kind of food that you thought you would, and so you couldn't pay the Lord, and so you would owe him that next year, on top of what you owed him that year as well. So some people did dig themselves into debt. I mean, of course, this would seem even a lot like our own age. But these people went by a different term. They weren't known as peasants, but known as serfs. And these serfs, being in debt, were legally bound to the land. That is, they could not leave until their debt was paid off. And this made up somewhere around 60% of Western Europe during this period. The majority of people that were peasants were serfs, that is, indebted to some manorial lord at the time. Now, serfs conducted most of the labor of the manor. They did most of the backbreaking sort of efforts, particularly in the agricultural manual labor, that is, digging furrows, harvesting, planting seeds. That's typically what the serf would do. And they would do this for themselves and for their lord. Now, peasants did this as well, of course, but serfs, being in debt, had it much worse. Now, typically what a week would look like is that the serfs and peasants generally would have 3 days of labor that they owed the Lord, that they would have to work the Lord's fields, the Lord's product, the Lord's tasks. And then they had to pay taxes for the privilege of the use. That is, that they had to use all the products and items that the manor had. Now, they didn't belong to you. I mean, if you're a peasant on the farm, if you're crossing the bridge doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the Lord. If you want to use the village axe, then you have to pay to use the village axe. If you want to use the oven to bake your bread, it's not your oven, so you have to pay a tax to use it. This is called taxes for the privilege of use. And that bill can get pretty high because, in general, they're using everyday objects and they're not for free. There's a tax. Now, you also have an obligatory tithe from the local church. Every single manor had a church, and every single manor was ran by a local priest, and everyone had to pay a tenth of their tithe to the church there. Now, of course, this is required through sustainability. The priest is not out there farming. He has spiritual duties, and so the peasants and serfs need to pay their part in allowing the priest to take care of spiritual issues for everyone. Now, things were pretty rough for serfs in general, though, because, again, being attached to the land, they really had very little freedom, certainly no freedom of mobility. So, of course, they had to ask the lord or the knight for permission to marry. It wasn't their life necessarily until their debt was paid off. to make the decisions that they wanted to. They also had to ask permission to travel. If they were to leave the village, they had to get permission, lest they flee or something. So, of course, the serf's life is really dedicated to that lord that night until his debt was paid off. So, in general, we've been talking about this group of people that kind of conduct all the manual labor for this society, and that is these people are largely referred to as those who work. But society is also divided into two other categories, really forming a kind of hierarchical trinity in European society. You have those who fight, that is, knights and lords, and their primary task and duty and existence is to protect the land, to protect the manor, to protect the people. I mean, if some kind of barbarian tribe comes in, or some hostile neighbor, it is the job of the knight and lord and those people to protect the farmers and to protect the priests. Which leads me to that third group, those who pray, that is clerics, priests, bishops, and their task was the protection of souls, right? So one was to protect the land, the other was to protect the soul of the people, and then the actual laborers protected the bodies of everyone in terms of feeding them and caring for them. And so the whole concept of this society really developed out of necessity after the fall of Europe and the Roman Empire to invading tribes. And so you really broke down into kind of micro units of survival and really had to require certain people to do certain tasks for the betterment of the community. Now, of course, these groups became entrenched and connected to birth, and so this becomes somewhat abused, particularly on the end of those who fight and those who pray, which we're going to see in a little bit. Now, what did the daily life of the peasants look like? Peasants lived in rather poor conditions, poor houses that consisted of about one room or two rooms, depending. Most people lived in a single room, and this single room was made of straw, sticks in general, clay, thatch, anything that you could get your hands on that would cover the structure. This depiction here in the image is actually a pretty wealthy person's home, because you can see that it has one long room, one small room. But in general, people would have one single room, that is where they would live in all aspects. They would sleep, they would eat, they would congregate, they would have meals together, and community living room. If you had two rooms, then you had the congregational room where everyone hung out and ate and things like that, and one bedroom where everyone slept together on one bed. Now, these beds aren't exactly what you would normally think of. They are made of straw, beds of straw, and so that's largely what we end up seeing for these sort of homes. As you can imagine, there's very little privacy in the medieval household. It's not like anything we see in the modern world, and so the kinds of things that people do in their own rooms was done in front of everyone. Going to the bathroom, which would not be done in the house, but go outside. But they really didn't have the notions of extreme privacy. I mean, people would be around you. Particularly, think about sexuality, particularly between perhaps parents, mother, mom, and dad. They're in the same bed with the kids, and so this really changes certain ideals. Well, one thing is for sure is that you had more of a subsistence kind of living rather than trying to get into prosperity. And so things weren't exactly pleasant. I'm sure things were very, very smelly and not very clean. It's not like you're taking, bubble baths or something like that every day. Certainly not. And you're sleeping with the animals in the house, right? If you're fortunate enough and wealthy enough to own an animal, a horse or a cow or pigs or whatever it might be, they would be sleeping in the home with you to protect you from the elements, protect them from the elements, to keep the house warm and with more bodies. Now here's an artist's illustration of what a wealthy kind of manor might have looked like, and indeed this does look rather wealthy. And in the distance you can see the manorial house and the church. You can see these quaint little houses that belong to peasants, maybe with their own personal gardens. You see the people harvesting wheat in the field. So obviously good agricultural output. We see a mill where people are bringing their grain to grind it down and loading it into carts. You'll see the village blacksmith. So obviously this is a pretty wealthy manorial system, but you can see kind of the division of labor that persists in this illustration. Now, what did that cycle of labor, that daily life, kind of look like for the average worker? Life followed various cycles of labor, and this was centered around harvest and planting season. Largely, we see hyper levels of work during particular seasons of work, and then long resting periods. So obviously, you could see maybe in the fall and the spring, you would have a lot of labor, right? Planting and harvesting and so forth. But during the winter, it might be fairly relaxed, that you wouldn't have a lot of tasks, a lot of labor to do. So while spread out, it might have been a decent amount of labor, maybe consistent with the everyday kind of person today. But during the height seasons, you would work endlessly, sun up, sundown, no question. You'd be up before dawn and in bed when the sun goes down. Now, every season, serfs worked not only their own land, but also the Lord's land. They had to do their duty as peasants, as serfs. And you would do this out of obligation because that Lord, that knight, is protecting you, protecting your family, and protecting the village. Now, the diet of the peasant was rather basic. Usually it looked like just having bread, goat's milk, nuts, berries, fruits, apples in general, maybe, eggs. But you can kind of see clearly there's something missing. Meat. Meat was a rich man's meal. In general, a peasant would never sacrifice the animal that they have just so they could eat them in terms of what they're valuable for. Now, a pig's not very valuable on its own right for any other task except eating. But think about like a goat or sheep or something like that, particularly a sheep. Think what it can produce. It can produce wool, a goat, cheese, and milk. Chickens, eggs. Why would you want to kill that thing? And so, for the most part, people would live on meatless diets, not out of principle, but out of necessity of survival. But of course, this is going to be an everyday battle for a high enough caloric intake. And so the most common drink was ale, a hearty beer. And this was pretty common, especially among the poor people. In fact, they probably drank a lot more than you might imagine. In fact, there are some records to indicate that about 3 gallons a day were drank in a single monastery. And these are people who are sedentary. One, you wouldn't drink a lot of water. Why? Because it might be unclean and people get sick off of unclean water. So people are drinking ale. It's a natural alternative and it's got a high caloric sort of intake for people drinking it. And so you get a lot of calories that way, which means the difference between life and death, health and sickness. So ale, breads, cheeses, fruits, those were kind of the typical medieval diet. Now, at this time, you end up seeing a kind of explosion of trade that begins to crop up where none had existed prior to this. Of course, you had medieval trade during the early stage connected to Rome, but after you have the barbarian invasion, you really see those complex trade networks dissolve as people leave urban centers. But new features include a revival of trade and associated kind of growth of towns and cities as people are moving back to those cities, moving back to those towns. These trade networks begin to revitalize. Some major urban centers that become trade hubs is Venice, which emerged as that kind of central hub in the 8th century that connected Western Europe to the Byzantine Empire. So this became kind of a focal point between these two regions for trade. Also, for our use, this will be really important, is Flanders, which was kind of a center of trade in Northern Europe, which focused on woolen trade, and everyone came to Flanders to trade their goods, their sheep, their wool. So this was an important location. But what we begin to see is a transition into a money economy. That is, an economy based on a coin, money, rather than barter, rather than trading two chickens for one sheep. You began to see the exchange of coins, which is a huge deal because, of course, it's not practical to go to some distant trade city with your wool, cart full of wool, and then trade for, say, you need actual more sheep, or you need something perishable like some kind of food. So it's impractical to trade directly through barter like that. So you begin to see coins becoming much more common again. It also allows for the emergence of banking firms to emerge, and bankings essentially are connected to commercial capitalism. Commercial capitalism is an economic system in which people invest to make a profit. So you go up to these banks that would essentially invest money in you for some business adventure you have, or some kind of business proposition that would turn a profit and return their coin with interest. So this began to crop up. But really, the bank is an innovative idea. The bank, or where the word bank literally means table in archaic Latin. And so, bank is a place where, essentially in the town, there would be some people literally sitting at a bench, and you would exchange coin for some kind of note slip often enough. And then you could go to a new region where that same bank might be set up. Usually they're just associates with each other. You would hand them the slip, and then you would receive your coin. That became increasingly more popular. Or just coming in and kind of selling your goods for coin at the bank. I mean, getting investments at the bank. There's all kinds of things that began to crop up at this time that might seem more familiar to the kinds of concepts we talk about in banks today. But of course, connected to all this is the growth of cities, and this is a really integral part of the revival of trade. And these merchants really settled in those old Roman cities that were abandoned during that barbarian invasion. So, of course, these are centrally located along trade routes, and they of course built large walls to protect their communities, largely from hostile neighbors, invaders. So of course these are major kind of trends that are emerging in these urban communities and urban centers. Now those who lived in these urban regions were merchants, artisans largely, and they were called the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, that is, they are merchants and artisans, right? That they're people who are trading in crafts and things like that. Now of course this term comes from the German Burg, which means essentially a walled enclosure, a city, a burg. And so bourgeoisie, those who lived in these cities, that became increasingly popular. And inside these cities, often enough, you had an explosion of industry through guilds. Now, a guild is a business association of craftspeople who are dedicated to a particular craft. So shoemaking or blacksmithing, something like that. And so you'd have a guild of leaders that would, in this community, in this region, set prices, standards, that would set the practices in terms of how it's made. Now, how one would become a part of this guild was through apprenticeship. An apprentice was usually a novice, somewhere around the age of 10, and they trained for a long time and became a master craftsman inevitably through their years of practice. Now, to get out of apprenticeship, you had to create a masterpiece that is the culminating work that demonstrated that they are no longer an apprentice. They had to complete some masterful, accomplished work that shows everyone that you know what you're doing. So if you're a shoemaker, you would have to make a particular style shoe. Or if you're a blacksmith, a particular sword or armor. And so this was a kind of a quality control process. Not that dissimilar to the kind of training that goes on today in these fields. Now, just to remind you, our objectives were 1. Discuss the new farming practices the growth of trade, and the rise of cities that created a flourishing European society. And second, explain how the revival of trade and the development of a money economy offered new opportunities for people.